Did you know that there is a math equation that virtually guarantees that you're either going to stay together and be blissfully married or get a divorce? I'm going to tell you all about that on today's episode. If you have listened to past episodes of this podcast, you have heard me mention the name John Gottman more than once. Now, there's a reason for this. John Gottman is a legend in the space of marriage and relationships. And I want to tell you a little bit about why, because it's relevant to today's episode. So back in the 70s, he was a professor at the University of Washington. He's also a graduate from MIT as a mathematician. And this mathematician brain got interested in psychology. And he's like, man, I wonder if I could predict whether or not people will get divorced. And so he decided that he would run a longitudinal research study. And basically what he would do is he'd invite couples into what they called the Love Lab in the University of Washington. And it was kind of set up like the Big Brother set. There was cameras all over the house, and there was a big two-way mirror, and they would have these couples wear heart monitors, and they would take urine samples and blood samples. And throughout their 24-hour stay at the Love Lab, they would invite them to have different types of conversations. And oftentimes they would have them bring up a conflict conversation just to watch how they navigated that specific topic. And they had people on the other side of the glass of that two-way mirror that were like watching their body language and coding their facial expressions, and they were measuring their heart rates during these arguments, and they were taking urine samples to measure for different hormones, and they had like a little machine on the bottom of their chair that they called a jiggleometer to see how much they were fidgeting in their seat, and they were trying to just gather all of this different data to see how couples responded to each other when they communicated specifically about difficult things. Now, they didn't make any predictions, essentially. They just kept following up with these couples over and over throughout the years. And after they had enough data, after, like a decade or more than a decade, they could take all of this information that they learned about these couples over the years, and they could come back and see who stayed together and who got divorced, and then see if there were any patterns in the data. And what was really interesting is that there were patterns, that this math genius who became obsessed with discovering whether or not he could figure out what makes relationships fail or succeed started to discover these scientific trends. And one of the trends he discovered was a mathematic equation. He calls it the golden ratio. And the golden ratio states that the happiest couples have a ratio of 20 positive interactions to every one negative interaction. So a positive interaction could be anything from holding hands, a kiss on the cheek, responding when somebody calls their name, asking each other how their day was, sending a text halfway through the day saying, I'm thinking about you. It doesn't have to be a grandiose gesture. It can be something as simple as just acknowledging that you heard somebody. So the more of those positive interactions you have inside your relationship, and the higher the ratio between positive to negative interactions, the better. And in times of conflict, the happiest couples, their positive to negative interactions would drop down to a 5-to-1 ratio. And so they were still having 5 positive interactions to every one negative interaction. Maybe they're having a disagreement and things are getting a little heated, but, one partner puts their hand on their other partner's leg, or somebody cracks a joke to ease the tension, or they say, hey, I know we're disagreeing right now, but I still love you very much. And they find ways to connect and be kind to each other despite being in the midst of conflict. The unhappiest couples had a ratio of 0.8-to-1 positive interactions to every one negative interaction. So the lower that ratio gets, or the closer it gets to a 1-to-1, the more likely you are to get a divorce. And this idea kind of got translated into a really common concept that is referred to often as the emotional bank account. And the idea here is just like you have a money bank account, the goal is to stay in the black, to keep as much money in your bank account as possible. The goal in your emotional bank account is to make lots and lots of deposits to ensure that if there's ever a withdrawal, you're not dipping into the red, you're not going into the negative, and you're not putting your emotional relationship in jeopardy. It's really fascinating stuff. So now I want to give you a hack, a trick to make sure that your love bank account, your emotional bank account stays full. Now, Dr. Gottman talks about this principle called bids for connection. A bid for connection is anything that you or your partner does to connect with the other person. It could be something as simple as sending a text throughout the day, or kissing each other before you part ways, or when you hear your partner go, You go, hey, what are you thinking about? Anything that's an emotional connection, a physical connection, a verbal connection, anything that could be an opportunity to connect is a bid for connection. And there's 3 different ways to respond to a bid for connection. You can respond positively, you can completely miss the bid for connection, or you can respond negatively and like swat the bid for connection away and reject it. Now, 2 of those things is not very good. We're shooting for the ideal here is that you want to respond positively to a bid for connection. And the reason that that's important is that the couples who are most successful, the couples who stayed together in Dr. Gottman's research studies, 86% of the time they were responding positively to their partner's bids for connection. The couples who ended up getting divorced, they only responded to each other's bids for connection 33% of the time. So if you're missing your partner's bids for connection or you're rejecting them, you're kind of setting yourself down a path of failure. So one of the interesting things that I learned studying Dr. Gottman is that most people don't intentionally miss their partner's bids for connection. There's 2 ways that you can miss a bid for connection that typically happens. One is that the bid for connection is wrapped in anger. And there's this really interesting concept that I learned from Sue Johnson. And she talks about how whenever your partner is angry or upset or critical of you, typically underneath that criticism or underneath the complaint is a yearning for connection. So sometimes the bid for connection is wrapped up in a big negative emotion. A great example is something that I think that we've all bumped into is your partner, either you come home later than you said you would, or your partner comes home later than they said they would. That can cause a lot of frustration. And then you can proceed to, let's set up a scenario that a husband is late coming home from work and didn't let his wife know. And she maybe had dinner on the table and she was getting frustrated and worried that he wasn't showing up. And then he shows up and then the normal fight ensues, which is, where have you been? Why didn't you call or text? What happened? You said you were going to be home at 5:30. It's 6:15. You're 45 minutes late. I can't trust you. I'm really upset. I'm really angry right now. We had all these plans. The kids are hungry and crying. I've had to deal with all this stuff myself. And this huge fight ensues. And then husband gets on the defensive and comes off and says, my boss called me in for a last minute meeting. I was doing my best. And then I got a phone call. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to provide for the family. And everybody starts having to justify their own stories. And what typically happens is, if you look underneath the disagreement, if you look underneath the fight, what you're going to find is that inside the anger is a bid for connection. And the bid for connection in this specific story for the wife is probably something like, I need to make sure that I can count on you and trust you and rely on you in my life, especially for the big things. And if I can't trust you to follow through on the small things, like showing up when you said you were going to show up, how can I be confident that you're going to be there for me during the times when I really, really need you? So the bid for connection is, I need to be able to trust you. I really want to feel safe and secure and like I'm a priority for you in your life right now. And if you can address that bid for connection underneath the anger, then the frustrations and argument about getting home late completely dissolves. It's amazing. It's a really cool thing. So I want you to think about first, what are the disagreements that you're having and the things that you often get angry with your partner about, and think to yourself, is there a bid for connection underneath that? And is there a way for me, instead of getting angry, to make a request? Instead of starting a fight, to ask for what I need, ask for the moment of connection. And if you're the one on the receiving end of the anger, start getting good at detecting the bid for connection underneath that anger, and you'll see that a lot of your disagreements go away. Now, the second way that you can miss a bid for connection is typically that you're distracted. And the number one distraction for most couples, do you want to guess what it is? I'll give you 3 seconds to guess in your brain. And then when I say it, you're going to go, oh my gosh, that's it. It's screens. It's your TV screen, your computer screen, and your phone screen. These screens are wreaking havoc on marriages. And the reason is because of the magic ratio. You got to have a really high ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions. You got to respond to your bids for connection. And when you're distracted with a device, when you're watching a show or you're stuck on YouTube or you're scrolling on social media and you're missing your partner's bids for connection, it's a withdrawal on that emotional bank account. It can really damage your relationship. So it's important to think about what kind of boundaries you can set with your devices. I know one man who runs 2 multi-million-dollar businesses. And one of the things that he does is when he gets home from work every evening, he takes a few minutes to decompress in his car in the garage before he goes inside, and he always leaves his phone in the car. And he doesn't pick it back up again until the morning the next day. And if he, who runs multi-million-dollar businesses, can do that, I know you can do it too. Another thing that people have done is they have a no phone rule in their bedrooms. Something that my wife and I did is that we moved our charging cables away from our bedside and we put it on the other side of the room so we can't be in bed and be on our phones. I have another friend, the Solars. They created something called the phone monster, and it's a tissue box that they turned on its side and they put little teeth and eyes on it. And if they're ever distracted by their phone, their kids or their partner can say, hey, the phone monster's hungry. And you put your phone inside the tissue box, you feed the phone monster, and then you can be more present with your family. And it's a less passive aggressive way of getting their undivided time and attention. So I want you to think about your magic ratio. This is how I'm going to wrap up this episode. Think about your ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions. Is it high? Is it kind of low? Could it be higher? What are the things that you could do to boost up those positive interactions? And then on top of that, think about your bids for connection. Are you putting yourself in a scenario where you're missing your partner's bids for connection? The biggest disagreements that my wife and I have had have almost all revolved around phone usage. One of my pet peeves is when I get in the car and it's just the two of us and we have an opportunity to connect and she's distracted on her phone. I'm also guilty of spending time on my phone. There's times where, she's been trying to connect with me after a long day and I'm totally zoned out and either playing a video game or on my phone, and it can be really frustrating for her. So we've made some commitments and agreements inside of our relationship to make sure that we don't miss those bids for connection because they're so freaking important. You should make time, your undivided attention to the person that you love the most in the world. And if you do that, the likelihood of you having a successful relationship skyrockets. Remember, 86% of the people who responded regularly to bids for connection stayed married. Or it's the other way around. All the people who stayed married responded to each other's bids for connection 86% of the time. And so you want to be in that category. You want to be in the group of people who loves being married, who enjoys being with their partner, who's looking forward to the next couple of years instead of dreading it. A huge piece of that comes from the ratio of positive to negative interactions that you have inside of your relationship. So if you focus on one thing this week, focus on increasing that ratio to at least as close as you can to 20 positive interactions to every one negative interaction, and then see what kind of difference it makes. If you experience something amazing, I would love to hear from you. You can hit me up on Instagram. It's just @growthmarriage. Shoot me a private message. Let me know how this little project that I gave you panned out, and if you had any epiphanies this week that made you go, oh my gosh, that might be the reason why we're struggling, or this might be the gateway to a better, stronger relationship. I'm excited to come at you next week with a brand new lesson. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you take a screenshot and share it on social media, tag me in it, let me know what you enjoyed, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook or anywhere else. I love hearing from you guys and I love hearing what you enjoy. It makes me want to create even more. And if you have a topic you'd like me to cover, you can also shoot me a line on the Instagrams. Okay guys, have a great week and I'll talk to you next week. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I really appreciate it, and I know my team appreciates it too. A lot of time and thought and energy goes into every single one of these episodes, so it means a lot when you listen. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are 2 things that I would love for you to do. One would be to take a screenshot of this episode on your phone and post it on social media somewhere, and then just tag me. I would love to hear what you enjoyed about the episode, if you learned something new today, if you were inspired to take action to make your relationship better. Tell me all the things. I love seeing those posts on social media, especially when I'm tagged in them. The other thing that you can do is leave a rating or a review on iTunes. When you do that, it helps boost us in the rankings and makes it more likely that other people who are looking for answers or looking for help inside their marriage will find us. And that is huge because it changes lives, as you know. So if you could leave us a rating or review, that would mean so much to us. I'm excited for you to tune in. And next week, we've got another great episode planned for you. Thank you again for listening.